Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of the Railway Tales. Today we're going to be looking into a railway history for Railway 200. With it being 200 years since the advent of railway travel for the public in the United Kingdom, starting in September of 1825. It's a long time ago. So today we're going to have a little walk. We're not going to have any trains today, unfortunately, but we are going to have a little walk along the lovely River Medway, near where I live. And I'm going to walk through history with you guys and talk about the 200 years of railways and all the different things that have happened in those 200 years, including some controversial points. Now, we're going to start our story in 1802 instead of 1825. And the reason for that is because the first steam locomotive to run on smooth railways was built by Richard Trevithick in 1802. Now, after this, a lot of railway boom happened in the United Kingdom, mostly in industrial areas, coal mines, travelling to docks, and also to cities or out to industries. But before this, in the 1560s, railways as a concept were around in the United Kingdom, but they were wagon ways before steel and iron rails. After Richard Trevithick built obviously the first steam engine, 10 years later in 1812 there was another locomotive built called Salamance. Now this locomotive was built as an 060 technically, but it worked on a rack and pinion system in the Middleton area. And then in 1813, the first locomotive was purchased for the Stockton and Darlington Railway. In 1813, William Henley and Timothy Hackworth built the first locomotive for the Stockton and Darlington Railway. This locomotive was affectionately named Puffing Billy, and there is a replica of Puffing Billy still here, but obviously the original is long since gone. Now, Puffing Billy was a small little loco, 060, with upright motion, very much Victorian-esque, and I'll try and put a picture of it on the screen now for you. After this locomotive, George Stephenson starts to come into the picture. A year later, George Stephenson built and designed a locomotive called Bolsher. Hopefully I've said that right. And it was the first locomotive to have a single flanged wheel. Now, because this locomotive was purchased, and at the time the Stockton and Darlington was the only biggest railway at the time, Stephenson was now adopted as the chief mechanical engineer, like he was for a few other railways, including the Canterbury and Whitstable Railway, which I've already done a video on, and I'll put a thing up the top here. On the 27th of September 1825, the Stockton and Darlington Railway became the first public railway to run a service with locomotion number 1 built by George Stephenson. Now, the reason why I say first public is because around the same time, if you click the little bubble above, you'll find out that at the Now, within a year, the Canterbury and Whitstable Railway also ran their first train. Now, the Canterbury and Whitstable Railway, this is where it's going to get controversial, because the Stockton and Darlington is given in history, obviously, as the first railway in the United Kingdom that can run passenger trains. But this was, controversially, a wagonway, so to speak. It was a freight railway before it was a passenger railway. And needless to say, the carriages were not brilliant. They were literally hopper cars turned upside down, taking everything out, put a few benches in, and that'll do kind of attitude. But the Canterbury and Whitstable Railway, which I believe should be written down as the first public railway, actually built for passengers between the two ports. Yes, they did haul freight as well, but they were primarily passenger trains between Canterbury, which was a cathedral city at the time, and Whitstable, which was one of the busier ports in Kent. Now, that railway we've already done a video on, and if you want to see that, obviously, click the bubble and you'll see it, and then come back to this one. Once, obviously, the Stockton and Darlington Railway started running trains, everything went mad in the UK, and what was called a railway boom. And everywhere that could, and in some places should, had railways built. Some places that should have had railways built used to have lines, but sadly are no longer here, which we'll get to later on in the video. But from the 1830s onwards, it was considered the railway boom. And we're going to talk about that now. Now, in 1830, in the history books, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway began operating regular passenger services. And as the name suggests, the railway ran between Liverpool and Manchester. And it was the first intercity railway of its type. Now, in Liverpool and Manchester's history, lots of things have happened, but not as interesting as what happened on the first day, which I'll get into shortly. But for those that don't know, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was operated by the most famous locomotive in railway history, in my opinion, which is Stephenson's Rocket, which was the first steam locomotive to have a tubular boiler. So instead of having a single barrel where the water was heated in the boiler, this boiler had smaller tubes running through that bigger barrel, which enabled it to be more efficient when heating the water, which is very key. Now, before the Liverpool and Manchester opened, there was a railway event, as it were, called the Rainhill Trials. Now, while the Liverpool to Manchester line was being constructed, there was a few people that was like, my locomotive is the best, and someone else would say, no, my locomotive is the best. And to settle the arguments, they had the Rainhill Trials, which consisted of 4 locomotives powered by steam and a 5th one powered by a horse, doing tests around Rainhill area, pulling passenger trains, seeing how fast they could go, things like that. Now, the overall winner was, of course, George Stephenson with Rocket, but there was an incident that happened during the Rainhill Trials where another locomotive's cylinders blew up. Now, a lot of people think this was due to sabotage, because at the time there was no real works, and the only real works to get anything made was the Stephenson works, ironically, the man who won the Rainhill Trials. But his main competitor went, I need some cylinders, and Mr. Stephenson can create them. So he got the Stephensons to create them. Now, people do say that Stephenson heard that he'd be at the Rainhill Trials and sabotaged the cylinders in some way to be weaker or not perform very well, and hence why they broke. Personally, I don't think that happened. I think it was due to, poor materials that were around very much so at that time. But yeah, the Rainhill Trials was interesting, lasted nearly a week, and eventually Rocket became the #1 engine, and the Stephensons got the contract to build locomotives to work on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Now, on the 15th of September 1830, when the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened, it wasn't just the first intercity railway, it also has a claim to another first, which is quite ominous in the railway world, It was the first ever railway incident that killed someone. Now, on the opening day, there were many trains about, and a lot of dignitaries, including the Duke of Wellington, and another man called William Hesketh. Now, William Hesketh was on a train that had stopped somewhere along the main line, and although people were told not to get out of the carriages, a lot of people did, and he also was one of those people that went to get out of the carriage. Now, unfortunately for William Hesketh, he fell off the side of his carriage and fell onto the other railway line that was there because the line was double tracked. At the same time that Mr. Hesketh fell over onto the line, Rocket happened to be coming in the opposite direction, and Rocket was not stopping. Unfortunately, William Hesketh lost his life that day on the 15th of September 1830, and will be forever known as the first man or person to die on a railway line. Obviously there was at the time an inquiry as to what happened, because there had to be back then, and apparently there was no fault for the railway, which beggars belief now. But yes, the Liverpool-Manchester has two firsts in its name. First intercity railway, and the first railway to have an accident that killed a member of the public. It's a shame, really. Now, after the Liverpool-Manchester Railway opened and got both of its titles, unfortunately, lots of railways were running up and down the country, small companies dotted all over the place, some even in the same cities as well, and towns. It was quite busy. But during World War I, the government had an idea, and this idea was to amalgamate the railways into what would be known as the Big Four. Now, unfortunately, this was during World War I, when our country was very busy, and at the same time, so was our railway network. Not many people realise this, but railways and war kind of go together, because railways are strategic. They can carry heavy amounts of freight with fairly limited restrictions, but they can travel it over great distances at a better speed than any army can. So during the war, in the First World War, the government used all of these railways to carry various things, including bombs, weapons, even troops. And more is known about World War II, obviously, which we'll talk about later. But during this time, the government realised it's very difficult to communicate with all of these individual companies and them communicate with each other. So we're going to pass an act that makes them join up into 4 big companies. And this came into effect in 1923, so very much after the war, and it was known as the Big Four in railway terms. And basically what it meant was the country was divided into 4. So you had the East Coast from London to Scotland, you had the West Coast from London to Scotland, you had the west of the country, i.e. Wales and Devon, Cornwall, and then you had the southeast of the country, which would be known as the southern area of the country, which would run towards Devon and Cornwall as well, but they'd also run from London to the Kent coast, for example, and down to Brighton. Now, these 4 big companies were all renamed, and you have the LNER, which is probably the most famous of all the Big Four, which we'll talk about a bit later with their engines, which ran from London up the east coast to Scotland. Then you had the London, Midland and Scottish, otherwise known as LRS. These ran up the west coast of the country from London to Scotland. Then you had the Southern Railway, which ran from London and predominantly ran around Kent and the south coast, and did stretch into Devon in some parts, but they weren't very good in Devon, in the West Country, compared to their competitors, which was the Great Western Railway. Now, the Great Western Railway was the only one of the Big Four that got amalgamated by its own self, weirdly. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, very famous engineer in the United Kingdom, built the Great Western Railway. Now, there is a little joke between the railway people as to why it was called GWR on the side of the engines. Some say Great Western Railway. Others, like myself, say the Great Way Round. And there are a few people that say God's Wonderful Railway, as they do. The reason why we say the Great Way Round is because Brunel had an idea in his head to run a railway the smoothest and flattest route possible, no matter how it went. So say he had a little hill in the way, he would dig a tunnel, which was very interesting at the time. Not many people did that. Now, we're going to briefly talk about the Western Railway, hence why I mentioned about the big grouping, because during its time, the Great Western Railway has some very interesting facts. It has a claim to fame with 100 miles an hour, which we'll discuss, also controversial. It also was the first railway not to adopt what we would later call standard gauge of 4 foot 8.5. Now, for those that don't know the railway terms, standard gauge is the gauge between the two rails, and predominantly in the United Kingdom we have 4 foot 8.5, which is standard gauge. There are gauges that are smaller than that, so anything under 4 foot 8.5 inches would be considered narrow gauge. Things like the Tallaght-Flynn Railway, the Sittingbourne-Kemsley Light Railway, even the Romney-Hove and Dymchurch Railway are considered narrow gauge. Then what Mr. Brunel was famous for is broad gauge, which is anything bigger than 4 foot 8.5 inches. Mr. Brunel had an idea in his head. Well, Mr. Stephenson runs 4 foot 8.5. Why don't we run 7 foot between the rails? And while we do that, we'll make our engines not only bigger, but faster and smoother. Now, slightly spoiler alert here, Mr. Brunel obviously did not win the Battle of the Gauges, as it was called. However, my personal opinion, if Brunel was given a bit more of a chance, personally, I think broad gauge might work better than standard gauge. And here's why. Mr. Brunel made the track 7 feet wide, which makes the locomotives and the carriages wider. Therefore, you could get more people in your carriages because they are wider. On top of that, the locomotives will not only be wider, they'd also be lower, so they'd have a lower centre of gravity, which would make them technically be able to go around corners faster without the need of modern things like banking and things like that. So I believe if Brunel had a shot, 7 foot could have been our standard gauge and could have worked a lot better. But because Mr. Stephenson had built 4 foot 8.5 gauge railways across the country, and running trains into London Paddington at the time was difficult with the dual gauge track. So unfortunately Mr. Brunel had to relinquish the 7 foot track and run the 4 foot 8.5. But that didn't stop him. Now, during his life, Mr. Brunel was a very, very busy man, not only with the Great Western Railway, but he also did some really interesting engineering feats, some of which are still there today. For example, the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, that was built by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Box Tunnel, which is a tunnel on the Great Western Main Line, at the time caused a lot of uproar with the travelling public, as they believed with Box Tunnel you were travelling too close to the devil and you would end up losing your life in the tunnel. In fact, you didn't. He did really well with that. There was a lot of issues building Box Tunnel, which I'll go into in another video, but yeah, Mr. Brunel built Box Tunnel. He also got the idea for Box Tunnel from the Canterbury and Whitstable Railway, which kind of shows how good that pioneering little railway was. He also built steamships, because Mr. Brunel at the time was like, well, I can't have my broad gauge track, that's not fair. I know what I'll do, I'll make a transatlantic route. So A transatlantic route, for those that don't know, is where you travel from, say, London to New York in America. Now, the way that Mr. Brunel devised this was you would board his Great Western train in London, you would travel down to Plymouth, and at Plymouth you would board one of his steamships that would take you across the Atlantic Ocean to New York. At the time, it was a very popular route, not just for the rich and famous at the time, but also for immigrants trying to start a new life. Now, some of the ships that he built over time, sadly, have been lost to history. But there is still one that's sitting in a dock in the Portsmouth National, Dockyard Museum, called the SS Great Britain. Now, that was one of his first steamships. It's the SS part, that travelled across the Atlantic to New York. But when he designed these ships, at the time, there was wind power was the main focus of travel. Now, before we go too mad on Isambard Kingdom Brunel, which I will do another video on at some point soon, with the advent of the Big Four, during this time, a lot of things did happen, which did help the railway world itself. Now, firstly, is a controversial topic, which is the first 100-mile-an-hour run by a steam locomotive. Now, if you was to Google this, which you're more than welcome to, it would tell you that Flying Scotsman LNER A3 Pacific number 4472 is the first recorded locomotive to reach 100 miles an hour. And to be fair, they're right. Scotsman was the first recorded locomotive to hit the magic 100. But the Great Western Railway, on the other hand, claimed, about 30 years beforehand to be precise, that City of Truro, one of their express passenger locos at the time, did a mail train run from Plymouth to London and clocked over 100 miles an hour. In fact, they said it did 103, which is a little bit higher than Scotsman's record. Now, City of Truro's run was not documented. It didn't have a dynamometer car, which is a vehicle that actually counts the speed, which was used on Scotsman's run. It was used by timings. Now, the problem with timings is anyone can say, I ran from point A to point B, and I did it in this time, and my average speed was this. When the same person of a different area could say the same thing, but have a slightly different time. And yes, it does come down to the weight of the train and things like that, but City of Truro apparently is the first locomotive undocumented to reach 100 miles an hour. Now, along with record-breaking runs like Scotsman's, another record-breaking run was happening around the world, actually, to do with speed, which was the world speed record for steam. Now, a lot of different railway companies across the country and across the world were running for the world's fastest trains. One of which was Germany, which happened to be our biggest rivals. And they were, to be fair, record holders of their own, but they did hold the record for the world speed record after the LMS had their record of 112 miles an hour with one of the Coronation class locomotives. Now, eventually, Nigel Gresley comes into this picture, because Nigel Gresley designed a locomotive more powerful than Flying Scotsman and a lot more stunning than Flying Scotsman. This locomotive would be known as Mallard, LNER A4 class, number 4468. Now, Mallard at the time of her speed record run, post-war of course, she was doing her run with being 6 months old for a steam locomotive. Now, 6 months sounds quite young, but in steam railway terms, 6 months is the prime time to do a run for a speed record, because the locomotive is at its finest. Now, driver Joe Doddington was at the controls of Mallard on the day and did break the world speed record by achieving the record of 126.5 miles an hour. Now, I say 8.5 because that's actually what's written down as his speed. A lot of people round down. Now, Mallard, again, was only 6 months old, but was severely damaged in the speed attempt. A lot of bearings became very hot, and on top of that, Mallard sadly had to go and get repaired after the speed run, but successfully, United Kingdom and the RTP Pacific did hold the speed record for 126 miles an hour. Quite fascinating. Now, as we're talking about the Big Four, as it were, a lot of things did happen in the years between 1923 and 1948. Now, this becomes apparent in a moment when I explain about 1948 to you guys, but during this time, around 1920 to 1930, the Southern Railway decided to electrify their railway, and they were one of the first to adopt an electrified railway in the United Kingdom, which, to the same design, basically still runs today, which is quite an achievement, to be fair. But they weren't the first. The first is obviously the London Underground, which I'll explain in another video as well. Now, the electrified railway for the Southern Railway became adopted by 1929 across most of their network, and majority of it still stands, but they're not the only ones to do the first of something. There is also the first diesel multiple units, which were built by the Great Western Railway in the 1930s. Oh, 1930s, that seems pretty early, but it was. They designed the internal combustion engine, and by this point, and of course the Great Western Railway, being pioneers themselves, thought let's try something new. And on a lot of their branch lines, they were using something called an auto coach, which is where there's a coach and a locomotive, and the locomotive pushes the coach up and down, and you don't run around the train. So the locomotive is only on one end of the train. But with the internal combustion engine being designed, and the diesel engine in particular, the Great Western Railway thought we can improve this by creating something called a railcar. Now, it has got other nicknames, including banana boxes, for some people that have been to Heritage Railways with one. But basically, it is a coach with two cab ends, one at one end and one at the other, and one driver, no steam locomotive, and it actually does the same job as the auto coach. But this is an adapted version of something they built earlier in history called the steam rail motor, which is basically a powered steam coach with a vertical boiler, which did the same thing. It powered itself and went up and down on a little branch line, predominantly in Devon and Cornwall. But they unfortunately scrapped all of the steam motors until recently someone has restored one, which is absolutely awesome. But with the rail motors, a lot of other firsts came along as well, like the first speed runs, as we just spoke about City of Truro and Flying Scotsman. And then, of course, Mallard's record-breaking run of 126.5 miles an hour. And that was in 1938, which was pre-war, which is quite good for a pre-war locomotive, being streamlined as well. Now, within a year of Mallard doing her steam record in 1938, we are at the start of World War II. And as people know, World War II was probably the worst conflict ever in the history of the world. But railways played a key part in World War II, and I want to explain why. Now, railways, as I said earlier, during World War I, were used to transport a lot of things like troops and armour. But with the advent of World War II, the government decided, how can we improve this? So they used bigger engines, obviously, because it's more modern. And at the time, they were designing locomotives to help with moving freight, which was quite handy, including sending a few of them across the English Channel into Europe to help with the war effort. Obviously, this happened after D-Day. But before D-Day, another event happened in the United Kingdom to do with World War II, which was the mass evacuation of children. Now, if you've not looked into World War II history, or don't know what I'm talking about, evacuations is where people from the city, for example London, would have children in their homes, and during the bombings and the blitz of World War II, the government decided it wasn't safe for children to be sat in cities, so they offered their children from London to other parts of the country, for example Devon, Cornwall, Norfolk, Suffolk, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, places that weren't getting as bombed or bombed at all. Now, the government were, hard pressed as how to move all of these children. And there were thousands of children evacuated during World War II, some of which were evacuated mandatorily and some were offered to go themselves. Some people did stay in areas that were supposed to be evacuated because it was the parents who ultimately made the decision. But why am I talking about evacuation and railways? Well, the railways made a key point of transporting these evacuated children, and they would pick them up from, argument's sake, London Paddington, and they would have a special evacuee train. It was an express train, wasn't going to stop anywhere apart from the designated stations for those children in little villages, hamlets, small towns, somewhere, for example, in Somerset or Devon, and they would go from London directly. Now, all the children went without their parents and were given little name tags around their neck. Now, those little name tags would have obviously the child's name, where they're going to, and the number, and that number was a reference number for the authorities at the other stations. They know this child goes to this family, and the plan worked. But if you're thinking, hang on, I know something similar with a little tag on it, it's because the idea for the evacuated children with those tags and their names on them features in a popular kids TV series and also a film series now as well, which is Paddington, the little bear from obviously Paddington Station from Peru. That style of name tag that says please look after this bear was taken from those evacuated children as a little memorial, as it were, for people to realise that's where it came from. Quite interesting fact. But they weren't just evacuated in one direction. Those children after the war were evacuated in the other direction on the trains, and there were also troop trains as well. So these troop trains would be the same as the evacuating trains. However, they would be full of army personnel, army soldiers, taken from, let's say, Maidstone, because there is a barracks in Maidstone in Kent, or there was during World War II, and taken to the ports like Dover, Folkestone, places like that, where they would board a ship, travel across the English Channel, and then go and fight in the war. But sadly, the railways were not affected, if that makes sense. They weren't affected, there we go, by the war. They were severely affected by the war. Not only by bombing from the German Luftwaffe, because they realised, this is a key target like we did to them as well, I might add. But also just the wear and tear on the engines, because they couldn't get the service they needed. Now, there is a story I'm going to tell you in a moment about something that happened during World War II, where a footplate crew, driver, fireman, and a guard and a signaller, saved an entire town from detonation. And I'll explain why. It was the night of the 2nd of June, 1944, in a small town called Soham. Now, this town, very quiet, desolate. During this evening, an ammunition train was travelling through the station, and unfortunately, a fire broke out in the first wagon behind the engine. Now, this train was carrying live ammunition, and it was packed. There was enough there to flatten a small town. Now, the fireman saw the fire, as it were, on the train, informed the driver, and they stopped short, so stopped before Soham Station. And during this, the driver and fireman jumped out, uncoupled the burning wagon, and tried to take it through the town of Soham before it detonated. Now, unfortunately, they didn't get through the town, but they did clear their train and managed to make their way into the station before the bomb exploded behind them. Now, there were some casualties, of course, and a lot of windows smashed during this time. But after the event, they were given bravery awards by the government and His Majesty at the time, the King, for their sheer bravery, for risking their own lives to save an entire town with an ammo train. Now, the Soham disaster is in history books, and you're more than welcome to go and read up on it. There's thousands of YouTube videos about it, so I'm not going to talk about it now. But those two drivers showed the driver and fireman showed bravery in a time where they were stretched. And in 1944, they didn't know, as we do now, that they were near the end of the war. But they were lucky, very lucky at Soham, that the whole train didn't explode, because there was an awful lot of ammunition on those trains, as the government decided to use the railways to move, ammunition, troops, tanks, even plane parts by rail. And they played other key roles during the war as well, including one little railway in Kent. Now, this little railway, everyone's probably heard of who's watching my channel, and I've already mentioned it once already today. It is the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway. This is a 15-inch gauge railway, very narrow, that runs from Hythe to Dungeness. But during the war, the Ministry of Defence, the MOD, took over the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway because of its key location. It runs along the Kent coast. Now, during World War II, the Kent coast was basically the front line for the battles of Britain, right there. So, the MOD crafted their own armoured train. They used locomotive Hercules, number 5, for those that know, and covered it in armoured plating. And they also fitted 2 Lewis guns to the train, one at the front and one at the back. And this would patrol between Dymchurch and up towards Dungeness. Now, one day, on a run, Hercules was travelling along the track, and they spotted an ME-109, which is a German fighter plane. Now, the German fighter plane also spotted the train. And weirdly, the pilot thought, because of its small size, he was too far up in the air. So he came a lot lower. Before he realised it, this little 15-inch gauge engine and its crew of soldiers and driver opened fire. And he was a lot lower than he expected. Needless to say, they shot it down. But this is the only time it was shot down. There are no other reports of it shooting any other aircraft because it's quite small, to be fair. And most of the time it was going to be aiming for any German troops that had landed on the coast to try and come and attack us from the land rather than the air. But Hercules has one, effectively, shoot down of a German fighter during the war. Now, not many people know about this. People that are involved with the Romney Hythe and Dymchurch Railway do know about this, and this is why they have an armoured train display at the railway. But it's not written in history books. It's just told in posts, things like that. But it is there that Hercules shot down one German fighter during the war. Now, other than that, there was no real armoured trains in the United Kingdom. We didn't have trains like the Germans that had massive cannons on them. We didn't have trains that had machine guns sitting in vans and things. We weren't like that. We were literally just moving freight and people. And 9 times out of 10, the lines were bombed, sadly, or stations were bombed, especially in the case of St Pancras in London. That was bombed quite a lot. But repaired, rebuilt and reran. But as I said, at the end of 1945, the railways were in a bad way. Engines knackered, railway tracks knackered, rolling stock knackered as well. Lots of things destroyed and needs replacing. So the government at the time devised the nationalisation, which is now the first nationalisation of British Railways. And this happened in 1948. On the 1st of January 1948, all the big 4 companies were amalgamated into British Railways. The first, as it is now, nationalised British Railways. The reason why I say the first is because at the time of recording, the government have decided to renationalise railways, which in my opinion is a good thing. But this would be the second nationalisation of railways. So when I say nationalisation, I'm referring to the first one in 1948. So, 1948, British Railways begins. And they're still running steam trains. There are a few diesels kicking about on the branch lines and things. A few new designs have come out, including the standard classes. Now, these are a range of locomotives that were designed to make it more efficient to run steam engines over at the time, the argument for diesel. Now, obviously the Southern Railway are still running electrics, but they did have steam as well for some of their routes. Great Western is still running steam, LNER, LMS. So BR took the best of them and said, let's have a trial, like they did in Rainhill years ago. And certain locomotives were taken away from their usual stomping grounds. So, for argument's sake, if they worked on the East Coast Main Line, they were taken to the West Coast Main Line and then down to Devon and down to the southern region, and were tested to see if their designs were any good to carry on. If not, what would be? And that's where we got the standard range from. So you have the standard locomotives, and there are quite a few of them. I'm not going to explain them all now, but one to note is the 9F. Now the 9F is a very big tender locomotive. It's got a 210O classification, which means it's got 2 little wheels at the front, 10 driving wheels, so 5 on each side, and then none under the cab. But the F in the name stands for freight, and it was designed to pull heavy freight. It did eventually make its way onto passenger work under BR for testing, but predominantly did run freight trains, and they were very, very good, very, very popular. And at the time the 9Fs were being built, the British government decided to dieselise the national network. So plans were being brought in for diesel locomotives to replace steam. So unfortunately the 9Fs, although be it the best of the best, as it were, the best design for the best period of time, only had a very short lifespan. But there was another locomotive that kind of goes under the radar unless you're in a railway area, but it's very famous. And this locomotive is called Evening Star. Now it is a 9F, but it was one 9F that was named by British Railway, and naming a steam engine back then was a rare achievement. But there was a survey to say amongst railway personnel what to call the last steam locomotive in production. Now there'd been loads of names throughout history: Kingfisher, Mallard, the Isle of Skye, Duchess of Hamilton, Princess Margaret Rose, Flying Scotsman, Green Arrow, Tangney, Fanline, but to name a few. But there was one engine that started it all off during the big boom, called Morning Star. Now this engine was a very basic engine, Victorian era Great Western engine. It was broad gauge as well. It was called Morning Star. Now a lot of people took it upon themselves to tell British Railways we should call the new locomotive Evening Star, as it's the last one. When they were asked why, the staff said, because we've come from Morning Star to Evening Star, to give it a nice round off. And I think that's very touching from railway people, especially back then when they had more pride in their locomotives. Not saying we don't now, but there definitely was more pride shown during the steam era towards their locomotives, especially with their own drivers. And it was a nice touch, and British Railway said yes. So we shall name this locomotive Evening Star. And they had a big opening day at Swindon and unveiled the name of the locomotive, and had it in a nice green livery as well, which it still runs in occasionally now. But there's another locomotive that came after Evening Star, which was Duke of Gloucester. Now Duke of Gloucester at the time when it was put into service was not a brilliant engine. There was a lot of flaws with it. It was a one-off. But after preservation, it did achieve something special. It did the job it was supposed to do. It replaced, in preservation, everything it was supposed to. It worked like it should do, which I'll explain in a proper video. But Duke of Gloucester was one engine that BR let slip, sadly. Now, speaking of one-off locomotives and British Railways, there was quite a few one-offs during the Big Four era, and some of them did make it into British Railways. Not all of them, because they were terrible, some of the designs, but some of them did. But they were scrapped, sadly, with the dieselisation. And British Railways were trying to think of a way to send steam off with a bang, as it were. You know, we're getting rid of steam, we're going to bring in this new age of diesels and be all new high tech, which at the start they really weren't as good as steam, but I'll explain in a minute. So they did the last few days of steam, and they ran the 15 guinea special. And the 15 guinea special was a special service that ran out of London up to Scotland, hauled by a couple of Black 5 locomotives, which happened to be a standard 5 as well, as the last passenger train in steam, which was a nice touch, in my opinion, especially with dieselisation being what it was. Now, with dieselisation, there was a lot of locomotives that came and went. Some of them did work, some of them didn't, which I'll explain the ones that did. So things like the Class 37. Everyone who knows railways knows the Class 37. It's got a nickname of tractor. But this came from the Deltic, which was built to replace the A4s, A3s, and all the other Gresley Pacifics on the East Coast Main Line. And it worked exceptionally well. There were some diesels, like the warships, that did not work exceptionally well, that were plagued with issues, and still are today. Unfortunately, it's a design fault. But, needless to say, dieselisation carried on, and British Railways continued until the next big event that happened in the railways, which was sectorisation. Now, sectorisation, what is it? Well, during 1972, British Railways was reorganised into different sectors, and these sectors consisted of passenger services, for example Intercity, and what would later be known as Network South East, along with some others as well. And also their freight divisions would be sectored off as well, so be split up from the main party, as it were. They'd be like, here's British Railways at the top, and then it'd branch off. Now this did and didn't work, and here's why I say it did work. Sectorisation of British Railways kind of worked, in my opinion, because you managed to split off the problem parts, i.e. freight, because at the time freight was starting to dwindle and passenger numbers were not going up because the service was terrible. Ask anyone that grew up in that era, passenger service was terrible. There's even documentaries on it. But when they rebranded, as it were, Intercity, Network South East, the railways gained a little bit more of a we're not just one big company. So some people started travelling again, which was good for the sectorisation. But the bad part was who they gave the track work to. Now, I'm not sure many people know this, but I'm sure most railway fans know who I'm about to talk about. And it's a name railway fans do not like to speak about because it brings up some horrible memories. And that's Railtrack. Now, Railtrack, for those that don't know, were the guys before Network Rail. They were the guys that were built, to run your railway. They would lay the tracks, they would fix the point work, they would fix the signals. They would even look after your track for you, apparently. And as we found out to our cost, Railtrack did none of that. Now, if you haven't heard of some of the rail disasters in the United Kingdom under Railtrack, then let me give you a brief rundown. Railtrack decided that they would have their main company, but then they would let the work be done by a third party, effectively contracting it out. But the problem with that was, you contract work out, you can't tell if they've done the job correctly or not. Now, this was a bad thing with Railtrack subcontracting, and this came to a head at a rail accident in Herefordshire on the 17th of October 25 years ago, the year 2000, at a place called Hatfield. An up passenger train was doing 90 miles an hour when the track gave way. Now, there's a lot more details to tell you, but this is a basic rundown. The track was maintained by then Railtrack, and the train was operated by then another company called GNER. Now, this train, tip-top form, high-speed service, went over a set of points. These points had not been maintained correctly because Railtrack had been passing the maintenance of the railway to a third party, which didn't know what they were doing. When the Accident Investigation Board came out, they solely blamed Railtrack for the incident, and it kind of became a keystone as to what happened with Railtrack and what we kind of knew about them and what we didn't. And as such, Railtrack ceased to exist. Now, there were other disasters on the railway, and I will do those in later videos. Now, the Hatfield crash wasn't the only one that sparked problems with Railtrack. There were others, including Potter's Bar. But eventually, Railtrack was gone and was replaced by what we know now as Network Rail, which is an improvement because a lot of things have changed since Railtrack with Network Rail, and they're a lot better in some respects. But there's still that problem when it comes to railways of associating the really bad and the not so bad and the good parts as all one problem, which I understand. But since sectorisation, things have got a bit better. Admittingly, we do now have the potential of renationalisation, and on top of that, we have other railway companies that are running around today, some of which are running with old names. Like, I'm sure you've seen adverts on YouTube, TikTok, on social medias, and even on the TV for LNER and Great Western Railway. Well, they have got their names from the original railways, as it were, pre-grouping. Great Western, obviously, for the runs down from Paddington down to the west coast of England, southwest, Cornwall, Devon, bit of Wales. LNER run back on the East Coast Main Line, which is awesome. We've also got Southeastern, which operate High Speed 1, which is the first high-speed service that's domestic, so within the United Kingdom, that travels at a high speed, so 140 miles per hour, which I have travelled on many times, and you don't actually tell how fast you're going. It's quite comfortable. But obviously we have High Speed 2 now being built. Whether that finally gets built, I'm not sure. Personally, I don't think High Speed 2 is a good idea. I'll leave it up to you lot to make your own decisions. But personally, I don't agree with it. Then, of course, we have the infamous Eurostar, which came around in the late 80s and was definitely running in the 90s. And I remember it as a child. But when I remember it, it was running out of Waterloo East. Now it runs out of St Pancras on the dedicated line, which is awesome. Fantastic. So railways are improving over time. But what's next for railways? What could potentially the next 200 years of railways look like? I think we'll never know. If you look back at history and you go back right back to Richard Trevithick and said to him, what do you think a railway looks like in 200 years? Do you think it'll be anything like we've got now? Do you think it'll be more futuristic? Do you think it'd still be steam? We'll never know. I don't have a TARDIS, sadly, but if I did, I would go back and ask him. But then, what do you think railways could look like in 200 years? Personally, I think it would be very much similar to what we have now, albeit faster trains, more comfortable, possibly all running on electricity or batteries, because batteries are becoming a thing. But I'll leave that up for you lot to decide. Let me know in the comments. What do you think railways will look like in 200 years? Do you think we've improved since Richard Trevithick? Do you think it would have been better in the steam era? Do you think it would have been better during BR? What could you have done to make it different? Let me know in the comments. That'd be quite cool to know. So that's it for today's video on railway history throughout 200 years, from Richard Trevithick all the way up to the modern high-speed train. If you enjoyed the video, please do give me a like down below and feel free to subscribe as well. There will be more videos coming out soon. And with that, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll speak to you all in the next video in the Railway Tales playlist.